Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't surface often. Hollywood legends rarely speak openly about disappointment, conflict, or the people who tested their values. And when they do, it's usually years later, when fame no longer needs defending and truth feels lighter to carry. Harrison Ford is one of those legends. For more than 5 decades, he has stood as a symbol of discipline, professionalism, and quiet authority. He never chased controversy, never fed gossip, and never explained himself unless absolutely necessary. But behind the iconic roles, behind the dry humor and guarded interviews, lies a man with firm principles about respect, loyalty, and how work should be done. Principles he never compromised, even when doing so cost him relationships. Over the years, Ford crossed paths with actors and directors whose approaches clashed deeply with his own. Some conflicts stayed silent, others spilled into public view, but all of them left marks. Now, with the distance of time and the calm of legacy, these moments reveal a powerful truth. Greatness doesn't come from harmony alone. Sometimes it's shaped by friction. To understand why certain collaborations scud Harrison Ford so deeply, you first have to understand the man himself. Ford didn't rise through Hollywood by chasing fame. He worked as a carpenter while auditioning, learning patience, humility, and respect for craft long before stardom arrived. That background shaped how he viewed acting. For Ford, a film set was sacred ground. Everyone had a role, every contribution mattered, and loyalty to the team didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. He believed criticism should happen privately, not through headlines. Discipline wasn't optional. Preparation wasn't negotiable, and ego, no matter how famous you were, had no place disrupting the work. These beliefs stayed with him through Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and every project that followed. So when younger actors, rising stars, or powerful directors approached filmmaking differently, casually, emotionally, or impulsively, it wasn't just a creative disagreement. To Ford, it felt like a violation of trust. That's why the conflicts you're about to hear weren't explosive arguments or shouting matches. They were colder than that. They were silences, distances, and decisions never to work together again. And in Hollywood, those choices speak louder than words. When Shia LaBeouf was cast as Mutt Williams in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, the decision carried symbolic weight. This wasn't just another role. It was positioned as a passing of the torch. A new generation stepping into a legendary franchise alongside one of cinema's most enduring heroes. On paper, it looked perfect. LaBeouf was young, popular, energetic, and unafraid to take risks. Harrison Ford, seasoned and iconic, brought gravitas and continuity. But from the earliest days of production, their differences surfaced. Ford approached the project with structure and discipline, treating the film as a collective responsibility. LaBeouf, however, leaned into spontaneity, experimentation, and emotional impulse. While that approach worked for him elsewhere, it unsettled Ford. Scenes required consistency. Timing mattered. Respect for the crew mattered. Small frustrations quietly accumulated. There were no dramatic blow-ups, no shouting matches, just a growing sense that they were speaking different languages. Ford tried to keep the focus on the work. LaBeouf pushed boundaries. What began as a generational contrast slowly turned into mutual discomfort, setting the stage for a much larger fracture yet to come. The real damage didn't happen on set. It happened years later in public. In 2010, Shia LaBeouf openly criticized Crystal Skull, calling it a creative failure and suggesting that both Harrison Ford and Steven Spielberg had dropped the ball. For many actors, criticism of a film fades into the noise of Hollywood. But for Ford, this crossed a line. He believed fiercely in standing by your collaborators, especially when they had trusted you with a role of that magnitude. To him, LaBeouf's comments weren't honest critique, they were betrayal. When asked about the remarks, Ford didn't hide behind politeness. He called them unprofessional, emphasizing that loyalty doesn't end with box office numbers or reviews. Behind the scenes, the relationship froze completely. Whatever warmth they had managed to create unscrun vanished. And while LaBeouf's words barely touched Ford's legacy, they followed LaBeouf for years. Spielberg distanced himself. Studios hesitated. The criticism echoed back, reshaping public perception. Ford, meanwhile, moved forward silently, carrying disappointment but refusing to engage further. Sometimes, walking away is the strongest response. The tension between Harrison Ford and Sean Young on Blade Runner is often misunderstood as personal dislike, but the reality is far more complex. When production began in 1981, Ford was already a global star, careful with boundaries and emotionally contained between takes. Young, early in her career, approached her role with deep emotional immersion. She stayed in character, carried the weight of Rachel's identity even when cameras weren't rolling, and lived inside the performance. For Ford, this created uncertainty. He preferred clarity, knowing when a scene ended and when reality resumed. Director Ridley Scott later admitted Ford sometimes wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Young or to Rachel. That ambiguity made casual interaction tense. The now infamous love scene only intensified the strain. Designed to feel cold and mechanical, it was uncomfortable for both actors. Crew members recalled the air on set growing heavy whenever the scene was mentioned. While Young later described feeling isolated and unsupported, Ford remained silent, never offering public commentary. That silence became its own statement. Their lack of chemistry wasn't hostility, it was incompatibility, magnified by a film that demanded emotional exposure neither experienced the same way. On The Devil's Own, Harrison Ford and Brad Pitt represented two generations of Hollywood power, both talented, both respected, but fundamentally misaligned. Pitt signed onto the project first and quickly grew uneasy with the script, pushing for changes that deepened his character's emotional complexity. When Ford joined later as both actor and executive producer, his vision differed sharply. Ford believed the emotional core should center on his character, a seasoned police officer facing moral conflict. What followed wasn't collaboration, it was a quiet tug-of-war. Scripts changed constantly. Scenes were rewritten overnight. Crew members described an atmosphere of constant adjustment where no one felt grounded. Ford valued decisiveness and structure. Pitt leaned into emotional instinct and exploration. They rarely argued openly, but the tension was unmistakable. Years later, Pitt called the film one of the most irresponsible productions he'd ever experienced. Though not nomming Ford directly, the implication lingered. Ford never responded publicly, but he never worked with Pitt again. In Hollywood, that choice speaks volumes. The conflict between Harrison Ford and Alec Baldwin didn't happen on set. It happened in boardrooms and headlines. Baldwin starred as Jack Ryan in The Hunt for Red October, expecting to continue the role. Instead, he learned through the press that Harrison Ford had replaced him. Baldwin believed Ford used his influence to secure the part, calling the move cold and calculated. For Baldwin, it wasn't just losing a role, it was losing momentum. Ford, however, never addressed the accusations. Industry insiders suggested he accepted the role when offered and focused solely on delivering the performance. He went on to define Jack Ryan for a generation. Baldwin's resentment lingered for decades. Ford's silence never broke. During Hollywood Homicide, Harrison Ford and Josh Hartnett clashed over work ethic and tone. Ford approached the film with seriousness and structure. Hartnett favored looseness and spontaneity. Ford interpreted this as lack of commitment. Hartnett felt controlled. Crew members noted the lack of warmth between them. Even promotional appearances felt strained. The film suffered, critics noticed, and both actors moved on quickly, relieved to leave the experience behind. Ford's conflict with Ridley Scott on Blade Runner was philosophical. Ford wanted Deckard grounded and human. Scott wanted ambiguity. Endless takes, vague direction, and post-production battles deepened the divide. The voiceover narration became a breaking point. Ford intentionally delivered it flat, hoping it wouldn't be used. Scott resented losing control. Their tension shaped a masterpiece, but peace never followed. What connects all these stories isn't ego, it's principle. Ford never chased dominance. He defended structure, loyalty, and respect. When those values were crossed, he didn't fight publicly. He simply withdrew. That restraint protected his legacy but left scars. Harrison Ford's silence isn't weakness, it's choice. In an industry fueled by noise, silence becomes authority. He let work speak. Distance became boundaries, and boundaries became protection. Ford chose legacy over comfort, craft over popularity. That choice cost him friendships, but preserved respect. These clashes remind us that greatness isn't smooth. It's shaped by resistance, discomfort, and uncompromising values. Now, with decades behind him, Ford doesn't need explanations. Time has spoken for him. So now that you've heard these stories, one question remains. Which name surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments. And if you value deep, honest Hollywood stories, like, share, and subscribe.